In the late 19th century, as the United States expanded beyond its continental borders, ideas of racial difference would become widely accepted at home and help define a new role for America abroad. At the turn of the century, popular culture promoted stories of race as a unifying force of national identity. Race was a common topic in the new monthly magazines.
A whole new middle-class readership was interested in reading about it. They had people from the House of Representatives, Supreme Court justices, experts, scientists writing in these magazines, purporting their particular visions and views on the so-called race question, the Indian question, the Negro question. People consumed it without even understanding the science that went behind it, that, hey, if this expert's talking about race in the North American Review, it must be correct.
Popular magazines contribute to an emerging sense of what is and what isn't American, who's white, who's not, who's better, who's worse.
The unifying principle is a principle of white supremacy. It's a principle of shared racial identity. And if you are white, or if you can be made to identify with whiteness, you are going to be considered to be in. And that line of whiteness cuts across class lines and provides a way to unify Americans on the basis of race.
All through the late 19th century, there is this constant message hammered at poor white people. You may be poor. You may have miserable lives right now, but the thing that's most important, the thing we want you to focus on, is the fact that you're white.
In 1898, the United States took possession of Guam, Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Philippines after defeating Spain in war. When McClure's magazine published the poem, "The White Man's Burden," Americans seized on the phrase that embodied the country's new role as a world power. Rudyard Kipling's poem was a rallying cry for empire and a racial justification to send American troops across the Pacific to put down the Filipino rebels fighting for independence from the U.S.
Take up the white man's burden. Send forth the best ye breed. Go, bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new-caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child.
Kipling wrote the poem to try to encourage the United States to annex the Philippines. And clearly, it probably provided more support for those who want to take on the white man's burden, because some of the imperialists said, oh, we can bring them along, maybe not to equality, but our little brown brothers, we can advance them in civilization.
Even advertising took up the phrase. Pear's soap claimed to be a potent factor in brightening the dark corners of the earth as civilization advances. Not all Americans supported the Philippine War, but race fueled the arguments of many anti-imperialists as well. One Southern senator declared, "We of the South have borne this white man's burden of a colored race in our midst since their emancipation and before. It was a burden upon our manhood and our ideas of liberty before they were emancipated. It is still a burden."
If you look at the way Filipinos are represented, they are represented not as Filipinos. Some Filipinos are portrayed as being akin to African Americans. Some are portrayed as being akin to Native Americans.
Use of the imagery of African Americans and Native Americans would have been important because these were familiar peoples. Their faults were familiar to the citizens of the Republic.
At the end of the 19th century, race is a kind of integrated totality. It embodied these sort of cultural, linguistic, psychological, moral, and biological characteristics into the concept itself. The concept is quite rich. It carries all these kinds of connotations. There's not a gap between what the regular person on the street understands about race and what scientists or anthropologists or social scientists think about race.
America crushed the Filipino independence movement, and the Philippines became a U.S. territory. The United States gained a strategic port in the Pacific and began a campaign to civilize another set of natives. America entered the 20th century as the world's most prosperous nation and newest empire. In 1904, St. Louis, Missouri staged a World's Fair to showcase America's achievements and celebrate the 100th anniversary of Thomas Jefferson's Louisiana Purchase.
The 1904 World's Fair was America's triumph of civilization, imperialism, and a new century. It was filled with hope and optimism. The organizers wanted to show America's unbridled progress.
People go to have fun, to be sure, but World's Fairs are not about entertainment. They're billed as world's universities.
In neoclassic palaces of progress, fairgoers wandered through technological and cultural exhibits. But on the other side of the fairgrounds, they were captivated by human exhibits, people on display in their so-called natural habitats.
They would have these exhibits of little brown people to show, oh, that's a savage. Look at the way they carved that wood. And the barbarians, as you moved up the evolutionary tree. Oh, isn't that interesting? I see it's different than the savages.
Fairgoers see an enormous number of people who perhaps they've only read about, maybe even never heard about. But here they are, living flesh and blood, there to be seen. World's Fairs are very adept at organizing categories of human beings on this continuum, from savagery to civilization.
One fair organizer described it as a practical illustration of the best way of bearing the white man's burden. On display for all to see were the subjugated people of America's recent past. An exhibit titled Old Plantation served up a bucolic view of slave life. And Geronimo, the legendary and recently defeated Apache warrior signed autographs for a fee.
Here you have not only American Indians put on display as a kind of vanquished people, but you also have at the fair a direct link made between Manifest Destiny on the home front and America's burgeoning drive to expand overseas.
The Philippine Exposition was one of the largest and most popular exhibits. Created to demonstrate the benefits of America's civilizing presence, the exhibit gave Americans a chance to see the people they recently conquered.
Part of the World's Fair was also about showing where you were as a white citizen. And a lot of people took pictures next to the so-called savages. And having a white body next to a dark body demonstrated how civilized they were.
Nearly 20 million visitors to the fair received an object lesson that connected an understanding of race to a vision of America's future.
One of the metaphors that's constantly used over and over again at the fair is the metaphor of the highway of human progress. Who's in the fast lane? Are you part of this advancing order of Caucasians, or are you somebody else, somebody other?
White people saw their advance as being historical, and this gave them an enormous motivation to see the lives of people who were not white as being outside of history and not part of this progressive advance.
Most Americans believed that race was one of the most important parts of national life. That race mattered because it guaranteed this country a future in the history of the world. The United States would rise towards glory, towards history, towards its destiny.
After 6 months, the St. Louis World's Fair closed on December 1st, 1904. Its grand exhibit halls demolished soon after. But race, a story first told to rationalize deep social divisions in a society that proclaimed its belief in equality, would be carried forward into the 20th century and beyond.
We are a society based on principles literally to die for. Principles that are so wonderful it brings tears to your eyes. But we're a society that so often allows itself to ignore those principles. We live in a kind of heightened state of anxiety because we know we aren't what we could be or what we say we are.